Okay, so we have looked at the adaptation gap, and UNEP also puts out a report on emissions gap every year. Obviously, that's where the gap between where we need to be for the global warming targets and where we are headed with the current policies and NDCs and so on. And the tagline is telling again the closing window. Climate crisis calls for a rapid transformation of societies, which means we are already falling behind. I'll read the executive summary points overall and for the financial financial sector aspects of it, and then we'll look at some figures on how these numbers stack up. Okay, so uh, this this is the 13th edition of Emissions Gap Report and is a testimony to inadequate action on global climate crisis and is a call for rapid transformation of societies. Since the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties COP26 in Glasgow, there has been very limited progress in reducing the immense emissions gap for 2030. The gap between the emissions reductions promised and the emissions reductions needed to achieve the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement illustrated in the following. So these numbers will come back to in a graphical format. Countries' new and updated nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, submitted since COP26 reduce projected global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 by only zero point 0.5 gigatons CO2 equivalent, compared with the emissions projections based on the mitigation pledges at the time of COP26. So many countries have submitted updated NDCs, but they are mostly things that were already there or uh, would have been done anyway, so they are not adding much in terms of additional drawdown. Countries are off track to achieve even the globally highly insufficient NDCs. Global GHG emissions in 2030 based on current policies are estimated at 58 gigatons CO2 equivalent. The implementation gap in 2030 between this number and NDCs is about 3 gigaton CO2 equivalent for the unconditional NDCs and 6 gigaton CO2 equivalent for the conditional NDCs. As we have discussed before, unconditional NDCs are those that the countries will carry out anyways, whereas the conditional NDCs depend on various caveats like climate finance being available to implement some of these things and internal legislative processes and so on and so forth. The emissions gap in 2030 is 15 gigaton CO2 equivalent annually for a 2 degree C pathway and 23 gigaton CO2 equivalent for a 1.5 degree C pathway. We'll look at this again. This assumes full implementation of the unconditional NDCs and is for a 66% chance of staying below the stated temperature limit. If, in addition, the conditional NDCs are fully implemented, each of these gaps is reduced by about 3 gigaton CO2 equivalent. Policies currently in place with no additional actions are projected to result in global warming of 2.8 degrees C over the 21st century, so way past the 1.5 and 2 degrees C targets. Implementation of unconditional and conditional NDC scenarios reduce this number to 2.6 degrees C and 2.4 degrees C respectively, which is still way above the 2 degrees C target. To get on track for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C, global annual GHG emissions must be reduced by 45% compared with the emissions projections under policies currently in place in just 8 years, and they must continue to decline rapidly after 2030 to avoid exhausting the limited remaining atmospheric carbon budget. As you remember, the atmospheric carbon budget remaining is related to the fact that warming is almost linearly dependent on cumulative carbon since industrial revolution. So each additional ton is going to add to it. So if you know the target you are aiming for, like 1.5 degrees C, then you know how much more carbon you can emit cumulatively to reach that target. In terms of financial actors, to date, most financial actors have shown limited action on climate change mitigation because of short-term interest and conflicting objectives. and because climate risks are not adequately recognized. Six approaches to bringing about a financial system that is capable of the shifting of finance flows needed for systemic transformation are identified. So we'll run through those. Increase the efficiency of financial markets. So key interventions include the provisions of better information, including taxonomies and transparency on climate risks. In developing country context, priorities will include capacity building and strengthening institutions so that you can actually make these emissions gap reductions happen in terms of adaptation and mitigation. Introduce carbon pricing. This can be done through policy instruments such as carbon taxes and cap and trade systems. So bottom up market forces and top-down legislative tools. Emissions trading schemes and carbon taxes now cover 30% of all global emissions with a global average price of $6 per ton of CO2. Both the coverage and the price are insufficient for transforming the financial system. The International Monetary Fund has suggested a global average price of $75 as required by 2030. So carbon pricing is not commensurate with the climate impacts right now or the climate risks of the future. Nudge financial behavior. Climate finance markets are subject to deep information asymmetry, risk aversion, and herd behavior, all of which result in inefficient choices. Policy nudges can achieve better results with strong public policy interventions, taxation, spending, and regulations positively influencing behavior. Create markets. Public policy action can remove existing market distortions and accelerate new product markets for low carbon technology, pushing innovation through public finance and replacing older, inefficient, and fossil fuel based technology. Development banks, including green banks, can play a more active role to stimulate financial markets as newer product markets are being accelerated. Multilateral development banks can support market creation through shifting financial flows, stimulating innovation and helping to set standards, for example, for fossil fuel exclusion policies, greenhouse gas accounting, and climate risk disclosure, which is becoming more and more mandated for corporations and so on. Mobilize central banks. Central banks are increasingly addressing the climate crisis. In December 27, 8 central banks and supervisors established the Network for Greening of the Financial System, NGFS, which has now grown to 116 members and 18 observers. Mandates of central banks in developing countries are often broader than those of central banks in developed countries. More concrete action towards this approach can therefore be observed. For example, the Reserve Bank of India requires that commercial banks allocate a certain proportion of lending to a list of priority sectors including renewable energy, and Bangladesh Bank has introduced a minimum credit quota of 5% that finance institutions must allocate to green sectors. Set up climate clubs and cross-border finance initiatives. These can include just transition partnerships and can alter policy norms and change the course of finance through credible financial commitment devices on cross-border financial flows such as sovereign guarantees. Okay, we know already the numbers. We looked at this several times. Total and per capita GHG emissions of major emitters in 2020, including inventory-based land use change forcing. So you have total greenhouse gas emissions being dominated by China with some reductions due to land use climate change forcing. Similarly for USA and India, so the ranking is pretty obvious by now. Indonesia is going through bad deforestation and land use change, which is actually resulting in additional emissions as opposed to reductions or uptake of carbon in some of the other countries, including the Russian Federation. Amazon deforestation, of course, is getting a lot of attention, and Brazil has positive emissions from there. And of course, you have also fossil fuel CO2, methane, N2O, flue gases, and so on. Okay, so we have to worry about these things. Per capita GHG emissions, of course, USA dominates with Russia, China, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on, coming down here with India at the bottom. But these can be a little bit misleading because the numbers for India are averaged over a very vast socio-economic structure where the richest top 1 to 10% may be living at very high carbon footprints, whereas the poorest of the poor are living with very low carbon footprints. So as economy grows, per capita shifts much slower than one would imagine because of this averaging over very large populations. Okay, the impact on global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 of new and updated unconditional NDCs relative to initial NDCs submitted by countries show that many countries add a little bit in terms of additional reductions. For example, here India has a tiny bit and Indonesia has a tiny bit, which is the impact since COP26 here in terms of the additional commitments. So you can see that the green ones are impact of new and updated NDCs, so they decrease in emissions. Impact of new and updated NDCs which increase emissions here for Brazil, for example, bad news, and also for Indonesia and so on. And non-G20 countries are doing their part, and there are many countries which have zero impact or no new or updated NDCs. So these are the players here. It's important to track these things, but also remember that many of the revised plans are not as glorious as one would hope for. But looking at global greenhouse gas emissions under different scenarios and emissions gap in 2030, you can see that the historical emissions here up to 2020 or so, and then 2010 policy scenarios would take us to these very high numbers. Current policy scenarios bring us down to the number we looked at before, 58 gigaton CO2 equivalent or so. Unconditional NDC scenarios bring that down a bit, but leave a gap of about 23 gigaton CO2 equivalent for the 1.5 degree C target. Conditional NDC scenarios would bring that number down to 20 gigaton CO2 equivalent, and if you want to raise the bar and allow 2 degree C warming, of course you will have 15 gigaton CO2 equivalent here, and 12 gigaton CO2 equivalent here from conditional NDCs to 2 degree C warming. So this leaves you a total of median estimate of 41 gigaton CO2 equivalent for the 2 degree C warming target, and you have to bring down by 33 gigaton CO2 equivalent for you can have to bring the emissions down to 33 gigaton CO2 equivalent if you want to hit the 1.5 degree C. So there are ranges involved here for different scenarios as you go into the future, and there are a large number of scenarios involved, and the numbers are provided in the report, which I'm not going to go into. But if you look at the emissions trajectories implied by the nationally determined contributions and net zero targets of G20 members in million ton CO2 equivalent per year over time, you can see that there are various commitments made here. For example, net zero greenhouse gas targets, or net zero only CO2 targets, which allows methane and other greenhouse gases to escape this counting, or net zero with unclear or CO2 only coverage. And there is the historical data and emissions trend until 2030 implied by the NDC targets, and so on. So you can see that Argentina is not heading in this direction but remains flat. Australia is doing well, Brazil not so well, Canada doing well, China is in fact still increasing, and so is India, and EU is headed down nicely. Indonesia headed down but not as fast as it should for its own target. Similarly, Japan, Republic of Korea, South Africa, United Kingdom and USA are headed down, whereas there are countries like Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Turkey headed up. So obviously some serious bending of the curve has to happen along the way if the countries are to meet their own proclaimed net zero targets even without including the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. The report also looks at important actions to accelerate transformations in electricity supply, industry, transportation, and buildings by different actors, which include national governments, international cooperation, subnational governments, businesses, investors, private and development banks, and citizens. I won't read all of them, but obviously we go for electricity, industry, transportation, and buildings. We'll come back to the food sector later on. There are a number of actions like removing fossil fuel subsidies in a socially acceptable manner, supporting zero carbon industrial processes, set mandates to switch to zero emissions road vehicles by specific dates, and regulate towards zero carbon building stocks, and so on. International cooperation would require on just phasing out coal or cooperating on zero carbon basic materials, cooperate on financing and policy development, provide access and favorable conditions to finance, and so on and so forth. So I won't read all of those, but it's a very nice table that you can go through. In terms of food systems, emissions trajectory, and mitigation potentials by transformation domain, you can see in 2015 we were just under 20 gigaton CO2 equivalent from the food sector, about 1/3 of the emissions, which is expected to go up to almost 24 gigaton CO2 equivalent by 2030 and almost 30 gigaton CO2 equivalent by 2050. So the reductions can come from the demand side changes, protection of ecosystems like wetlands, coastlands, grasslands, reduced deforestation, and so on, farm level improvements, and decarbonizing the supply chain to head towards the 2°C target and not even the 1.5°C target. So there are details here of less loss and waste, flexitarian, pescatarian, vegetarian, and vegan diets. How they would come about is not always clear, but it just tells you how much emissions reductions can happen by relying on these scenarios for the future. Okay, of course it also includes manure management, crop nutrient management, rice management, feed composition, soil carbon managements in grasslands and croplands, and so on and so forth. Finance flows and mitigation investment needs per sector. You can look at type of economy and region. I didn't include the whole set of scenarios here. This is averaged until 2030. So you can compare to the average flows over 2017 to 2020 in these bluish colors and look at where we need to go in terms of billions of US dollars, 2015 US dollars per year. So energy efficiency, IEA estimates says we have to bump up to 7 times the current flows if we want to look at annual mitigation investments needed in terms of multiplication factors being the low end or the upper end. Transport 7 times, electricity up to 5 times, agricultural, forestry, and other land use up to 31 times the amount needed. And types of economies, developing countries versus developed countries, 7 times for developing countries and 5 times for developed countries in terms of actual yearly flow compared to average annual needs. Again in US billion dollars pegged to 2015. But it's also useful again to look at these in terms of percent GDPs at the low and high ends to make sure that we don't get shocked by the absolute numbers, but setting aside a fraction of the GDP is easier to incentivize if it is order less than 10%, for example, especially when we will consider the co-benefits in a minute and the costs of climate impacts if we don't do anything. Just as an example, look at India's revised NDCs. In August 2022, the cabinet approved an updated update of India's NDC. Updated NDC has led to major policies being pushed forward, including electric vehicles, co-firing of biomass pellets in thermal power plants by 7%, ethanol blending in petrol by 20%, inclusion of agroforestry and private forestry, solarization of agricultural pumps, clean cooking by shifting to liquefied petroleum gas, and rooftop solar PV. There are also recognition of the role of lifestyles that India has proposed lifestyle for environment called LIFE has been proposed to foster a citizen-centric approach to combat climate change. One has to wait and see how this will work out in terms of behavioral changes, especially in terms of rich people reducing emissions and allowing poor people to come up in standard of living by increasing their emission. The Lok Sabha passed the Energy Conservation Amendment Bill on 9th August 2022, aiming to facilitate the establishment and development of domestic carbon markets. So hopefully this will work out as well. The market's objective is to incentivize actions for emission reduction expected to result in increased investment in clean energy and energy efficiency areas, especially in the private sector. Okay. Getting closer to the end of this summary, estimated implications for global GDP of mitigation measures, co-benefits and climate damages. So here we stand in terms of change in percentage GDP, what is expected in terms of baseline growth in the 5th to 95th percentile and 25th to 75th percentile. Modeled mitigation costs for the 1.5 degree limit and the 2 degree C limit with different probabilities, estimates from the assessment report 6. So model GDP reductions or losses in 2050 relative to median baseline GDP growth will be higher for 1.5, more stringent of the climate targets, but the co-benefits appear as good numbers in avoided crop yield losses, avoided lost labor days, public health benefits and dietary change, global coal phase out, as well as air quality improvements. If we don't do much, estimated economy-wide climate damages relative to medium baseline growth, GDP growth, will be smaller for 1.5 degrees C, so that's still not a good thing, but this is the best we can hope for. Will obviously go up for 2 degrees C warming or 2.5 and 3 degrees C warming. So we will pay a price in terms of GDP losses if we go stingy on expending for mitigation costs. Looking at this agricultural mitigation potentials again, the report provides potential solutions and barriers to food system transformations by actor group, which includes national governments, cities and local governments, private sector, civil society, and even academia. Looks at major transformation gaps, potential solutions, and barriers. I won't read the whole table, but it has enormous amount of details in the report, including a very nice long list of references from where these are synthesized. But you can look at things like absence of national strategy and clear measurable targets can be gaps in major transformations. Potential solutions can include things like science-based national food system transformation strategy and corresponding national coordination and accountability mechanisms. At the national governance level, the barriers can come from unbalanced power across ministries and their objectives. For example, Energy Ministry, petroleum and liquid gas may have much more power than agriculture or health and so on. And in private sector, you can have lack of commitments being a gap, whereas monitoring disclose progress towards environmental commitment and give progress reports and scores for reliability, transparency, and credibility can put pressure as well. While economic profitability versus social and environmental objectives can be barriers. So how to manage the profit motive with the need for environmental and social objectives are always something that we are already dealing with. In fact, when you look at the case of how Volkswagen cheated on emissions, or how Toyota was fighting electric vehicles because it invested in hydrogen fuel cells and so on. So this is always going to be a two-step forward, one-step back kind of dance, especially when you look at the impacts of unrelated, non-climate related crises like the Russian war or the COVID-19 lockdowns and other geopolitical perturbations and so on. So this gives you a good idea of what the emissions gaps are all about, and this report keeps coming out every year, so I'll keep tracking those provided I'm still doing this next year and the year after and so on. Okay, let's leave this here.